Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to welcome you to tonight's event, to my Kampf today, ideology, memory, and the question of censorship. A panel discussion organized jointly by the Pears Institute for the Study of Antisemitism and the Baeck Institute, London. My name is Daniel Wildmann. I'm the director of the LBI London, and my thanks go out to Professor David Feldman, the director of the Pears Institute and the Pears Institute and all its staff, for co-organizing this panel. It's a real honor and a pleasure to work with you. Tonight's topic is quite political, at least in Germany, and it raises many questions. For example, the question of censorship. Until recently, it was quite difficult to officially get hold of a copy of Mein Kampf in Germany. Why was this the case? Germany presents itself as a success story. We have overcome the past, so it goes. But if this is indeed the case, why then did the German authorities feel the need to so carefully regulate the access to Mein Kampf? Either ordinary Germans have left their past behind them, or they have not. Thus, regulating the access to Mein Kampf not imply that the German success story might not really be a success story. It looks a little bit as if the German authorities do not entirely trust their own folk. Or the aesthetical question of having published a very beautifully designed, annotated edition of Mein Kampf. Usually, publishers and editors do such a thing to honor a writer, a philosopher, a scholar, man, women, men such as Plato, Goethe, or Shakespeare, Hannah Arendt. What is the implication of doing the same for Hitler? Do we now turn Hitler into a serious scholar and thinker? Or the question of ideology. Mein Kampf is mainly a book about promoting a mindset, a Haltung, as you say in German. And at the center of this worldview is antisemitism. One major aim of the editors was to point out the many errors and false facts in Mein Kampf, to correct them, and to provide the reader with the right information. Fine. However, since when are anti-Semites interested in facts and footnotes? And this leads me to the question of memory. Who then is really the target audience for this book, the annotated edition of Mein Kampf? Who were the editors writing for? Who did they want to educate? Perhaps we observe in Germany once more, I would say, not kind of dialogue or non-dialogue between a younger generation of scholars and the generations of their parents and grandparents, those Germans who did form the Third Reich. Maybe they are really the audience the editors are trying to speak to. As we know, millions of copies of Mein Kampf were sold in Nazi Germany, and probably most German households owned a copy of the book, and quite many were really reading the book or part of the book. The book was indeed widely read in Nazi Germany. So perhaps the editors are trying to prove to that generation, the generation of their parents and grandparents, that they got it wrong. To believe in Mein Kampf was a big mistake, a really big mistake. The annotated edition is over 2,000 pages long. Fine with me again. However, would they, the editors, the Institute for Zeitgeschichte in Munich, not better have published 2,000 pages of memories and diaries of Holocaust survivors to prove that Hitler was wrong? As you see, there's a lot to discuss here, and I'm very happy that we have 3 brilliant panelists with us tonight to find answers to these and other questions. So let me introduce our panelists. Firstly, Neil Gregor, over there in the middle. He's a professor of modern European history at the University of Southampton, and his research interests range widely within the 20th century history of Germany, business history, cultural history, literary studies, and one of his main interests are the history of the Third Reich and its aftermath. He has published, of course, widely in all these fields. Only recently, for example, the book How to Read Hitler, published in 2015, or more recently, published in 2016, he was the editor of a collection of essays entitled Mein Kampf lesen, 70 Jahre später, Reading Mein Kampf, 70 years later. Next to me, Maiken Imbach. She's a professor of modern history at the University of Nottingham, and her main research areas are, firstly, cultural history of cities in Europe, 1850 to 1945, and secondly, very important for us in this context, National Socialism. In particular, is emotional and personal history. And currently, we discussed a lot about this just before, she's working on a very big, extremely interesting project on amateur photography in the Third Reich. And finally, sitting over there, David Aronovich. David Aronovich is a columnist and broadcaster. I think most of you know him. He wrote for The Independent and The Guardian, but this was another time. He once called himself a Euro-communist, which I think is great. Currently, he works for The Times and the Jewish Chronicle, really another time, but he also presents BBC's Radio 4's news program, The Briefing Room. I'm very happy that you're all here on the panel. How do we proceed now? First, we will listen shortly to the panelists, first to Neil, then to Maiken, and then to David, and then David, the other David Feldman, will take over to chair the panel. So I hand over to you, Neil.
Thank you. Let me just check that the microphone is picking my voice up at the back. Is that okay? Yeah, great, lovely. I've done enough of these things where people come to me at the end and say, I could just see you waving your hands, to know it's good to ask. Well, thank you for setting this panel up. It's the 3rd or the 4th time over the last couple of years that I've been asked to speak on a panel or at an event like this. Some with Maiken, in fact. We've done a number of workshops together, talked together on the radio, done podcasts, both done things in the newspapers and so on. And at the point at which we were invited to come and do this event, I really had a sense that maybe I'd said all that I wanted to say about this. But since we were invited to speak here, the fascist language has gone so mainstream again in the political discourse of the West that I think it's as topical as ever. And for that reason alone, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share some thoughts and some discussions. To pick up on the buzzword of censorship, I think we can treat this in 3 ways. The first, in the abstract, of course, Mein Kampf is the great litmus test for conversations about free speech. It's the great litmus test for a conversation about liberalism and its limits, if you like. A conversation for what the limits of the sayable and the speakable are in a liberal polity. It seems to me, in fact, that's a conversation you can have without Mein Kampf in the room. And so I don't propose to say much about that. I think really we're asked to be a bit more specific here and treat this as an issue that encapsulates, firstly, in very highly symbolic form, a particular set of dilemmas and problems that a set of challenges that have faced Germany since 1945, how to handle the toxic legacies of a genocidal past. Legacies that a society knows it has, wishes it doesn't have, has chosen to face up to, unlike many societies with genocidal pasts, and sees that not just as a burden, but as a moral responsibility. But thirdly, and I think just as importantly, it seems to me increasingly pressing and increasingly pertinent to take this story outside of a German context and focus the question of free speech, fascist language, not just in a conversation about Germany since 1945, but in a conversation about the threat of the far right across the Western world in 2016. Well, to pick up again on the question of free speech, I think this is a slight misnomer insofar as nobody who was arguing that it was the right thing to do to republish this book because of the end of the copyright of the text was suggesting that they wanted to give fascists a voice. Nobody was trying to give Hitler a platform in republishing this book. And it seems to me the decision to republish, the choices about how to publish and what form and so on, seem to me to have represented a very intelligently pragmatic set of responses to dealing with an issue that had no ideal solution. As a piece of editing, I know some people feel slightly differently, but I think it's remarkably impressive. I think it's a superb tool for scholars, and it would be very unfair, really, to say anything other than that. These are people who've done their work very, very carefully and produced something that those of us who work with this text, I think, are very grateful for, really. If one wants to pick up on the ambivalences, though, I think there are two traditions in which this act of editing sits. The first is a kind of Mandarin professorial pronunciation of the truth that we should all think or see, which seems to me to be a particularly German tradition. Experts working close to the state, seeing their task in terms of service to the public, service on behalf of the public, offering a pronunciation for us all to acknowledge, if you like, and absorb. There's a certain kind of patrician academic tradition there, which goes all the way back to the Wilhelmine era, about which I think one can only feel a tiny bit ambivalent, and that picks up on some of the ambivalences that I think Daniel was alluding to. Similarly, or secondly, and I think more positively, there's an unmistakably German tradition of liberal...
Excuse me, would you speak into your microphone and speak a bit slower?
Yeah, there's a...
Thank you for that.
Well, speak and I'll there's an unmistakably German liberal civic tradition of public pedagogy aimed at fostering a sort of democratic, politically aware, democratically committed, historically informed citizenship, which I think one can only admire too, in fact. The latter is something I've always particularly admired, but it's the strengths and the weaknesses of the latter tradition in the moment in which we find ourselves that leads me to feel it's worth picking up the topic again and talking about it anew. Up until recently, I felt quite robustly confident in my view that both pragmatism, principle, political judgment all pointed in the direction of the decisions that the Institute of Contemporary History took in respect of republication. I've always felt that Germany is one of the most robust democracies in Europe. It's a place in which the far right is present, but it is very powerfully contained by the equally stronger countervailing forces of a very robustly committed democratic majority. Germany has its far right, in other words, but the democratic sensibilities and reflexes of the majority, I think, have always been much stronger since 1945 than they are in this country, for example. And I think I still believe that, but of course this year has given us cause to reconsider, to reflect upon the dangers, the expanding appeal of the far right, the widespread prevalence of forms of rhetoric that we thought were in retreat, the unspeakability of sentiments that we thought had become unspeakable. So the second half of 2016 has become a moment where I think those of us who inhabit the liberal bubble of the university have been very rudely confronted with what in retrospect feels like a great deal of complacency on our own part. It's not that things went away and have come back, I think it's that they were always there. Despite that, just to draw these opening remarks to a close, I still think it was the right thing to do to republish this book. I think it's too easy, and mostly a mistake, to draw two straight, bold, simple lines between the far right of the 1930s and the manifestations of right-wing politics that we see today. I think it's too easy to draw links between the presence or absence of a scholarly edition of Mein Kampf and what is happening now across Europe and the West. For all that one recognises that there are neo-Nazi strands in the Alternative für Deutschland, for example, and for all that one can trace an archaeology of neo-Nazism back from the Alternative für Deutschland, back through the Republikaner, the NPD, and back to the NSDAP, I think it makes more sense to read the Alternative für Deutschland against UKIP or against the Front National, rather than in a sort of continuity with the Nazi past. Even if we refocus our sentiments more specifically on the resurfacing of anti-Semitism, my sense is that for a long time the ebb and flow of anti-Semitism in Europe has more to do with the vicissitudes of the Arab-Israeli conflict than it does with the presence of neo-Nazi sentiments that have their archaeology directly in the 1920s and 1930s. So in that sense, I don't feel that any of the stories of racism, xenophobia, hostility to Europe, anti-Semitism, and all the other horrors of this year would have panned out particularly differently had Mein Kampf been coming out of copyright or not. And I don't think they'd have panned out that much differently had the book been republished in this form or not. So my closing comment is really for now that I still welcome the publication of this book. I think it's an excellent tool. I think we've learned that you can't quarantine fascist language and that it's a mistake to think that you can do so just by banning a single book, however much of an aura that book might have. So as a tool, I welcome it, and I'm pleased that it's there. Thank you. Mike?
Does this work? Yes. Okay. Thank you. It's a great honor to be here. The republication of Mein Kampf by the Institute for Contemporary History in Munich is a symbolic act. There was never a question of the actual text not being available. There were over 12 million copies produced during the Third Reich, and of course many of them survived. They are still present on bookshelves in Germany. The text is also freely available on the internet, in German as well as in nearly all other world languages. There's also a new printed edition which has been around for some time that was produced in the United States but in German, as well as of course many English language editions. What is more is that the book continues to enjoy a popularity worldwide that I think is easy to overlook if you're confining the gaze to Western Europe. The book has long been on bestseller lists in India. It's increasingly widely read and cited and recycled in the Arab world, and it is perhaps most disturbingly on the curriculum of many business school degrees in Asia as a manual for leadership. So there's a lot to think about here, and I think what the IFZ, the Institute in Munich, were trying to do with the new edition was not so much to spread the text as to exercise a kind of ideological containment of the way in which it is used in the present. And to do so, they drew on a German philological tradition, which Daniel mentioned in his opening remarks, this particular German institution of the critical edition. What I want to pick up on here is the ambiguity of the term critical in this project. So critical here has really two functions that blend into one another. And I think some of the confusion around what the text does or the edition does has to do with this seepage between these two different versions of the word critical. So on the one hand, critical is here understood as a direct, head-on political critique. The EFZ very much presented the edition as a sort of counterattack on Hitler. The introduction speaks of the need to debunk Hitler, to disprove Hitler, to disarm Hitler. In fact, the language of the framing introduction is in some ways almost worryingly militaristic. Metaphors just such as taking Hitler into the crosshairs are all over the place in this edition. Visually, this is manifested by a technique of literally encircling the text in its entirety in footnotes. And again, the term encirclement is something used by the editors. So the actual text of Hitler's prose takes up less than a quarter of the space on each double page, and it is entirely framed by blocks of footnotes. Footnotes that are correcting Hitler, or supposedly correcting Hitler, challenging the claims that he makes and juxtaposing them with modern historical views. I think this idea of bringing to bear a kind of modern academic authority and counterposing that with the voice of Hitler has been amplified by the fact that the edition has in public been presented not by the editors or not by the leadership of the very large editorial team who produced the critical edition, but by the director and the deputy director of the Institute of Contemporary History, neither of whom were directly involved in the editing process. So Andreas Wirsching and Markus Brechtgen have been touring Germany, but also this country, giving multiple talks and talking in the media about the moral purpose and political mission of this edition. So they've very much presented this as, if you like, a political task that is backed by their institutional authority rather than their direct scholarly involvement in the project. So this raises a question that Daniel alluded to in his introduction. Who are these gestures aimed at? Who is this going to convert? But also, what is the truth that is being invoked here to debunk the lies of the text? And I think therein lies a certain problem. Neil spoke just now of the Mandarin tradition of German scholarship. We find footnotes here that treat the views of modern historians as authoritative alternatives to Hitler's views. Now, take the example of Hitler's detailed account in the book of the reasons for the First World War, which is fundamental to his analysis of why we now need National Socialism. So we have Hitler's account, and then we have a footnote telling us why this is wrong and referring us instead to the account of Christopher Clark, who's the Regius Professor of History at Cambridge at the moment, and his latest book, Sleepwalkers. Of course, in many ways, Professor Clark's account is much more truthful than Hitler's, but it seems to me in some ways to misconstrue the very nature of modern democratic scholarship. This is not an authoritative assertion of an absolute truth that we can simply use to debunk Hitler. It is an intervention in a debate. Many other historians have taken issue with Chris Clark's account, but that is eliminated from the EFZ edition. This is simply a modern contemporary truth juxtaposed to the lies of Hitler, and I have some concerns about this strategy, and doesn't strike me as particularly democratic in nature, even though the intentions are obviously very worthy. Second, the second meaning of critical in this refers to the tradition that Daniel alluded to, a well-established philological tradition in German scholarship of producing scholarly editions of iconic texts. So the Bible, the Torah, Homer, Cicero, as well as more modern authors have all had these critical editions that in some ways are monuments to their enduring cultural authority. And the current edition, with its sheer physical weightiness, thousands of pages, these two big linen-bound volumes, in some ways, I think in a slightly unfortunate way, place Hitler's text in that tradition of canonical texts of Western civilization that may not have been intended, but it is partly what is symbolically conveyed by this act. And this is what I think has caused a sense of unease amongst many who have reacted and responded critically to the appearance of this tradition. So it's not the fact that Hitler is being republished, but it's this odd format in which it is done. Another aspect of this philological tradition of critical editions, however, is more interesting and I think more constructive in what the EFZ have produced here. Like many such classical critical editions, this one charts in some detail the sources of Hitler's text. Because Hitler was a great plagiarist. A lot of what you read in Mein Kampf isn't Hitler at all. It is cut and paste job from a whole host of authors. And while in some ways we've always known that, the sheer extent of this really becomes visible through this new edition in a way in which I think it wasn't before. So anything from Homer and Cicero and the Bible to Hobbes, Wagner, Nietzsche, Darwin, as well as a whole host of lesser-known authors of the 19th and early 20th century are in there. So the edition shows which of these texts Hitler borrowed from, what he copied directly, but it also shows a lot of related documents. So you will find a correspondence that Hitler might have had with some of these authors, about the use of key terms that he's adopting by trying to tweak and recycle and redefine. One key term is in German, the inneres Erlebnis, the interior experience, which comes from Ernst Jünger's famous novel about the First World War, The Experience of the Trenches, which Hitler adopts, but with some trepidation. So he doesn't quite like Jünger's politics, and there's a correspondence there relating to that. So that's, I think, a really valuable exercise, not just because it helps us to better understand the text, but because it helps us to understand a key function of this text, which was to normalize National Socialist ideology by embedding it, by rooting it in established canonical cultural knowledge, by making it respectable through these constant references of a sort of Western civilizational cultural tradition as well as political discourse. This is not a text that is a straightforward piece of propaganda. If you're looking for Nazi hate speech, look to Hitler's speeches and Goebbels' speeches, and interestingly, of course, these have been freely available in lots of editions in Germany as well as in this country and in pretty much every other country in the world for decades. It was only this text that was banned, not, I think, because it is a particularly extreme example of hate speech. In fact, it is much too tedious to read to have that kind of rallying effect on people. What it does instead is two things. It associates the cause of National Socialism very closely with the personal experience of Hitler, which is what makes it so difficult. It is, in a sense, the supreme ego document of National Socialism. But it also embeds this type of thinking much more in mainstream thinking and canonical traditions than any other Nazi document. And I think that raises really interesting and challenging questions about this process that in some ways we're really experiencing again now of the normalization, the mainstreaming of some of this extremist racist thinking and language that the Nazis achieved in part through this text. Okay.
Thank you, Mike. And now, David, please.
Thank you very much. And first I should obviously say that I am the inexpert part of this expert panel. And in all matters of interpretation and scholarliness, I defer to my co-panelists, which is a way of saying that they know what they're talking about and I don't really. Though we can have, it strikes me sometimes, different observations of precisely the same thing or different interpretations of the same artifact. I was thinking that actually just walking into this building today. As you know, this was Orwell's model in 1984 for one of those great ministries. But more to the point, and rather more entertainingly, in R.C. Sanson's recent thriller, Dominion, which posits the possibility that Lord Halifax, not Churchill, had taken over the government in 1940 and formed a compact, or rather a deal with Hitler, which had led to a kind of semi-fascist Britain. This whole building became the German embassy, and the downstairs cellars, therefore, the offices of the Gestapo. And actually, if you look around you, there is something kind of Speerian about the architect's vision of this building, both as you enter and as you don't. But of course, it's in London, built by an entirely different person, so it doesn't hold any of those associations, despite the fact that Speer would really have liked this place. And would doubtless have incorporated, maybe even borrowed things from the architect. I really have no idea. So, when we came to the question of Mein Kampf, well, the first thing I did was look for my copy of Mein Kampf on the shelf, not the what seems to be described, it sounds like to me like a super version of you remember those folio editions of books that they used to kind of try and sell you? You know, you could get an ordinary book, but it was so beautifully bound, etc., that it was that you couldn't even possibly think about picking it up and reading it, let alone taking it on the bus. I don't have one of those. I have one that came via the internet from America, and so on, with the ease that the internet provides, and like anybody else could. But I couldn't find it on my shelf, and it's going to be a terrible thought. Could I possibly lend it out to somebody? And if I had, what earth kind of person would that be? And in that case, I thought, well, what kind of people are you coming to an event like this? And is it possible that some of you are actually kind of, closet Nazis who were rather hoping that you would get a kind of disquisition on, what was in Mein Kampf, etc., from something closer to the horse's mouth? But it looks like very few of you actually are committed Nazis. So the question I asked myself was Mein Kampf actually important? This is not a stupid question, actually. Otto Strasser told the story passed to him by his brother Gregor Strasser, and I got it from Ian Kershaw's Hitler biography. Ian Kershaw taught me when I was at Manchester. That the suggestion to Hitler in the Landsberg prison that he write Mein Kampf had been given by an exasperated fellow prisoner on the basis it might give him something to do rather than to wander around interrupting their card play by giving speeches. And that it had this effect for a while, except that once he started dictating it and he got passages, he would then come and interrupt their cards by quoting his own passages back to them. And that they found that incredibly tedious. Otto Strasser, who fell out with Hitler later, he described Mein Kampf as a veritable chaos of banalities, schoolboy reminiscences, subjective judgments, and personal hatred. And so on. There isn't a person alive, as far as I know, who is not actually demented, who thinks that the book is actually readable or any good. And insofar as many German homes had them, then I imagine that in a sense it became like a kind of malign version of the brief history of time, which is one of those things that everybody felt that they'd better have, but that no one actually read. It was popularity of the book was not because of what the book was. The popularity of the book was because of its association with this extraordinarily charismatic figure at a time of incredible crisis in his country's history. And in a way, the book wouldn't matter very much at all. It probably didn't persuade many people to actually become members of the Nazi Party who weren't already that way inclined. And there is some argument to suggest there were probably some people who, quite like Hitler, then read Mein Kampf and rather went off it, and so on. The reason why I say that is because when we're talking about issues such as not just censorship, but if you like, the power of certain sorts of material over us and whether or not we should try and exorcise them, or whether or not we should warn about them and so on. I think it's as well to understand what a problem actually is. So, let's take an example. Here's the problem that exists in Austria, that David Irving was successfully arrested and imprisoned there for effectively, they call Holocaust denial. Was that the problem? Or is the problem that Norbert Hofer, the far-right candidate for president, is still evens to take the presidency when the rerun vote happens soon? Which of those would you say represented, if you like, a greater current problem for us? What is interesting about Mein Kampf is not that it persuaded people particularly, but that it represented something. Now, in the first instance, what it represented was Hitler's own thinking, and that it did. Hitler's own thinking about Lebensraum, Hitler's own thinking about social Darwinism. I mean, these were represented also in his speech, but nevertheless, here he drew them together in the context of his own mind. What it represented about his thinking about Jews, the eliminationist strand of Hitler's thinking about Jews, was all there present in Mein Kampf. I remember a rather good performance of David Edgar's play about Albert Speer, since I mentioned him earlier. He adapted Gitta Sereni's book, in which Hitler's ghost comes back and says, well, why did nobody take me seriously? They said they didn't know, but I wrote it all down. And indeed, he did write a lot of it down. A lot of it was written down in Mein Kampf. And yet, despite the fact that a lot of it was written down in Mein Kampf, what people said about the Hitler they wanted to imagine was that Hitler did not mean the things that he said in Mein Kampf, that they were not that important, that they shouldn't in any sense be taken literally. But that nevertheless, despite the fact you shouldn't take what he says literally, nevertheless he represented an authenticity that was in some way, I think the current word we use in these circumstances is refreshing. That was in some sense refreshing, was different from conventional politicians with their compromises and their deals and their incapacities and their incompetencies and their eagerness for the vote. It represented a kind of adamantine rejection of that kind of thinking. It did not or was not supposed to represent what it actually said. Now, it strikes me, as it may strike you, that this is precisely the moment that we are living through at the moment, right now, in which people dress the desire for authenticity and the strong speech in their own clothes. They give it their own edge, rather than that which is actually meant by the people that they end up supporting or giving succour to, and so on. Now, in some cases, this may or may not matter. So take an example. I won't labour the point too much. Take the example of Donald Trump's wall. Let's suppose that Donald Trump had written My Struggle by Donald Trump. Okay. And in that, he'd said, I want to build a wall. Most people, I think, who voted for Donald Trump have no belief that Donald Trump would actually build a wall. The wall is symbolic. It represents a rejection of people who are thought to blame for something and a rejection of the impact of change, you could say modernity or globalization upon people or the breakup of communities or whatever, but essentially it represents a change that they do not welcome and they do not want. Now in the case of Donald Trump, it may actually not be that bad a bet that he doesn't need to build a wall, but Hitler built his wall. And it's a poor assumption on the whole when people vote in large numbers for somebody who says they want to do something and that they believe that that something is symbolic rather than real, at the same time giving them the benefit of the idea that they are authentic. The rather wonderful cartoon in the New Yorker which showed a series of sheep standing in a field which had a wolf on it, and the wolf said, vote for me, I will eat you. And the sheep, one sheep said to the other, well, at least he tells it like it is. And I think we we were supposed to get a point about who that was that was allowed. So, rather than look at or worry about the impact of, say, a book like Mein Kampf, and I think actually the panel on the whole is fairly relaxed in the sense about the book and whether or not it would actually convert anybody in particular to views they didn't already hold. I would look rather at the lesson of what something like Mein Kampf is, which is on the whole the safest thing to do when you see people on the kind of more populist or demagogic edges of a political or whatever side. It is on the whole more sensible to take them seriously.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank all of our speakers for such stimulating and clearly articulated comments, which, if might be sort of summed up in a nutshell by saying they addressed the question of what was the significance of Mein Kampf then and what is its significance now. We have about 3/4 of an hour left for questions and discussion. I will gather 3 or 4 questions at a time and then ask our panelists to respond. I won't insist that all of the panelists respond equally to all of the questions and comments, which will allow more time for you to speak. I think we have a roving mic, so if you throw your hands in the air or even point a finger, I will ask you to speak and ask your question or make your comment. So now is your opportunity. There's a gentleman there.
Henry Cohn, does the panel think that the commentaries to Mein Kampf should be published in other languages for those who are unable to read German?
Thank you very much. And there's a question from the front from Peter Pulser.
Well, this is another version of the question that's just been posed, namely, who is this edition aimed at? May I suggest a tentative answer?
Mm-hmm, please.
I think it will be of most use to scholars or PhD students. It seems to me that anybody required to refer to Mein Kampf or read it could be helped in order to understand the context and the argument and the appeal. Beyond that, I very much doubt whether it's going to be very effective. We've heard, for instance, that Mein Kampf is used as a text in Asian business schools. But this is presumably an English language text. So the German edition, with its wonderful, marvelous Teutonic footnotes, this great German invention for academic contest is going to be lost on these people. And similarly, those who throw about Nazi-sounding slogans or proposals, whether it's the identity movement in Germany or France, or the alt-right in North America, they are not interested in this. They don't read Mein Kampf. And the very good reason for that is that Mein Kampf, and I think this hasn't been stressed sufficiently, is a totally unoriginal text. Hitler did not claim to have invented an ideology. He claimed to be, his claim was to implement what others, before the First World War, had propagated. So I'd be interested to know what the panel thinks. Who this book, who these annotations are aimed at and who's going to benefit.
Thank you very much. And just one more question there before we take it back to the panel.
If you were going to read Mein Kampf on bus, would you cover it in brown paper? And if so, why?
Thank you. Michael, would you like to start?
It's funny you should say that, because I was walking into a classroom at the University of Nottingham last week carrying the edition, and the classroom had been used in the preceding hour as a prayer room by our student Muslim society, and I was feeling slightly awkward about holding this volume as I was asking them to clear out the room because they were overrunning. But more seriously, well, who's the edition aimed at? I agree with your reservations that there'd be very little international impact, certainly, and is it just preaching to the converted? It is noteworthy that the first print run of, I think it was 5,000, sold out before it even appeared, and many of us struggled for weeks and weeks to get hold of copies, which we asked to review because they were nowhere to be had. So since then, I think tens of thousands of the book have appeared in the first 6 months or so of its original publication. So clearly it's more than just scholars and PhD students in Germany who are buying it. Who exactly is buying it, and most people are buying it on Amazon, is an interesting question. But I think there's a wider German public interest in how to deal with this legacy, undoubtedly energized by the recycling of some of these languages today. I totally agree, this is not a very original text in any shape or form, but what we see, that what Hitler does there, the recycling of all these earlier authors and strands of political thinking in this book, is of course something we're seeing again today, the recycling of some of these fragments, linguistic as well as visual, in contemporary neo-Nazi and alt-right movements in America. People are standing in these rallies doing the Hitler salute and shouting Heil Trump. They are, if you listen to them on YouTube, they are amply sprinkling these speeches with German terms, which in itself I find extremely interesting. So I think there is an appetite in that milieu to at least symbolically connect with these traditions, both the Nazis themselves, but also longer running traditions that they in turn drew on. So I think making that process of constant recycling and reappropriations of this extreme right and racist language visible through this edition is a useful thing.
Well, again, to start with Peter Polz's point about the originality, absolutely right, yes. But I think therein precisely lies the story, and therein lies the significance. And I think what this edition does superbly is show just how anchored in many very mainstream habits of 19th and 20th century thought the text of Mein Kampf is. No? Darwinist thought, the idea of history as something that has laws to it, the idea of history as being cyclical, history as struggle, all of these things, never mind the overtly racist languages, which are hardly peculiar to German thought in that period. So I think it's the very unoriginality of the text that in a way provides the starting point for thinking about how dangerous the language is. There's always been this tendency to think about Nazi Germany and Hitler and Mein Kampf in a sort of History Channel version, as if these are kind of cardboard cutout peoples dressed in black who beam down from outside of German history for 12 years, march up and down, and then leave again. I think this critical edition shows how important it is to kind of historicise Nazi speech and anchor it in those Western intellectual traditions. That would give me a starting point for picking up on what David said about the supposed unreadability of the text. I think this text back then was far more readable than we imagine. It's not like reading Schiller, it's not like reading Goethe, it's not even like reading Thomas Mann. But Thomas Mann now feels pretty difficult to read. It feels like a museum piece because many of the literary conventions that Mann works with are conventions we are no longer in the habit of reading. The same is true of Mein Kampf, the autobiography of the ordinary soldier, the work of popular history, the description of the unfolding of the authentic self in the form of the Bildungsroman, essentially, the 19th century novel of formation. These are all literary conventions that would have been far more familiar to ordinary reading people back then than they are to us now. So I suspect that book was not quite so difficult to read. I also think we're fairly clear that it was read far more widely than we used to think. It was read by trades unionists, it was read by churchmen, it was read by opposing politicians, and so on and so forth, all of whom provided commentaries warning against its contents, or indeed saying that they weren't that bad and that Hitler maybe had a point. Yeah? So the ideas of this book make their way into the mainstream of German society in the 20s more than we imagine. Who's it for? Well, I think that it's a kind of difficult to answer, but my sense is that one of the reasons this edition was produced was very much to head off the opportunity the moment afforded to a lot of far right-wing publishing houses to put out their versions and to claim that it was just for study purposes, for reasons that are entirely mendacious. The presence of this scholarly edition makes it much easier for the authorities to go after anybody else who publishes a knockoff version of this text now. The only reason you would publish it now, given the presence of this scholarly edition, is for reasons which are mendacious and are about inciting racial hatred, it seems to me. And it's all the more easy, given the presence of this version, to invoke the criminal code against the circulation of far-right literature if anyone tries to do that. So I think it's not just a book that's been produced for scholars or PhD students or the German critical interested public to think about and read. It was published for reasons which I think were also tactical and born of very careful legal thinking too, and I think sensibly so. But that's an instinctive comment rather than a factual one.
I think the only question I'm really competent to answer is, would I read it on a bus? Although I would just say about the question about who is it aimed at, I don't know, but it doesn't matter. We should know enough about modern communications and the way in which people behave, which is you can aim things at whoever you think you're aiming at, but they'll hit whoever wants to hit them. Quite a lot of blockbusters are word-of-mouth blockbusters from first-time writers, actually, that don't get the kind of publicity that established writers do. They do after they become blockbusters. And these books become, a classic example is Stieg Larsson's books, which you could argue are pretty badly written in many ways, and became an immense surprise hit by word of mouth in the first instance. Now, I'm not suggesting that the new edition, annotated edition of Mein Kampf, will have quite that kind of currency, at least not until it comes out in paperback. But we don't know. Whoever it's aimed at, it will hit who it's going to hit, and I suspect that's already begun happening. I suspect there are people out there who are purely curious and want to show their friends that they've got this extraordinary thing on their shelves. You'll never guess what I've got, and so on. There will be even people who are buying it for people as joke Christmas presents and stuff. It will be happening. So the answer is I just don't know who is getting it, but whoever it's aimed at will hit somebody else. And the question of whether you'd read Mein Kampf on a bus, and here's my suggestion: if you're going to do it, take a pen and scribble in it. always makes you look like an academic, or something like that. You're just kind of studying it. It sort of takes the whole kind of sting out. You're obviously doing it for a completely different purpose, etc. That's while you're trying to digest what possible use Malaysian business studies students could make about the sections on Lebensraum. Anyway.
Daniel, I don't know, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
Maybe just one very short remark regarding the question of brown paper. I bought the book in a bookshop in Frankfurt. It was a very funny experience. I bought it in a very large, big bookshop at the main railway station of Frankfurt, and there were piles of this book there, really many piles. I just went in there and asked the people in there, may I have my Kampf, please? They all blushed instantly, but they opened the book. But the blushing indicates, and I blushed too, to be honest. It was very awkward and funny at the same time. Me, being a Jew from Germany, buying my Kampf in Germany now, but the blushing indicates there's something else going on there. So far, they sold 80,000. That's really a blockbuster in Germany. Even South Friedlander didn't sell more than 50,000 of his books in Germany. So it's sold better than South Friedlander, big book about the Nazis and the Jews. And I think that's an important question to answer. I don't have an answer yet, but something is going on there, and it's totally unclear who are the buyers and why do they buy the book. It's an open question, but I think it makes clear that something is not solved yet in Germany. I think what we're observing here is an inner German debate. I agree with Nee. We have to bring in the perspective from the UK, from other countries, otherwise we are stuck in an inner German debate. We're really stuck there. But there is an inner German debate going on, and the question is, what kind of debate do we observe? And I'm talking again about, to bring back the argument from before, we're talking about perpetrator literature, not the literature of the victims.
There are some questions just on the left-hand side. If we just take those three.
You discussed who the book is aimed at, but who, if anyone, should be afraid of it? I mean, should it be Jews, Romies, gays, Democrats? Who? Because obviously, in its particular context, it was aimed at a narrow group, albeit in the service of a master race concept. But today, where it's so diffuse, and as you say, it has a lot of markets around the world, who particularly should be afraid of whatever message is going to be perpetrated by the book?
Thank you very much. And there's a question just inside there.
If this book is a blockbuster, just an amount of interest, who's getting the royalties from it? And is there a history about that? Because I was involved in a debate about the royalties on the edition in the UK once, and the library had a very interesting debate about that.
Stephen, I'm not a German specialist, I'm a Russian specialist. And one of the things I'm working on at the moment is Russian disinformation. This kind of disinformation is the word we get from Russia. They took information from us, they make disinformation, and it's come back into English. So it's actually one of the few words in English that come from Russia. What strikes me, one of the things working on disinformation is actually to try and point out to as wide a public as possible how much disinformation is currently being put out by Russia. And relevance of this to what we're talking about here is, would the scholarship that's gone into producing this edition of Mein Kampf, could it not be taken further? Would it not be much more useful if you actually talked a little bit about the ideas that are swarming around Europe and the United States and other countries, indeed Russia as well, at the moment, but actually apply that scholarship, taking texts apart and saying, this is what this actually means. And it actually could have a very, very significant importance for current texts and texts that have been on Twitter, be there modern methods that are being put out, but actually taking these things apart and putting out to the general public what some of these significant mean, some of these things mean.
Thank you very much. We'll Well, I'll take a couple more in the interest of getting as many people as possible in. If there are a couple down the front here.
So obviously this was obviously triggered by the issues of copyright surrounding Mein Kampf. But my so question is, do you think that this packaging of Mein Kampf will maybe set a precedent or indeed a pressure for other influential right-wing texts to also be packaged in this kind of way? Or should Mein Kampf remain an isolated phenomenon in this industry?
And just one last one for the moment at the front here.
The heading of this talk is actually about censorship, but the censorship only was in Germany. It wasn't really very much around the rest of the world. It's a very big seller in the Islamic world. And I don't think people are really reading it, they're just buying it because it represents an idea. And I think that is the biggest problem with Mein Kampf, is this idea. Just want to see what your opinion on that is.
Neil, would you like to start off on this round?
Well, the short answer is no, I wouldn't.
Notwithstanding.
Yeah. I mean, I take all that's been said about the way in which there's a certain sort of commodity fetishism surrounding this object, and that there's a certain conceit of ownership attached to it, I suspect, amongst people who are unlikely to look at it for more than 30 seconds. Who is buying it? I don't know. I'm slightly less worried about the idea that this is, being packaged up and is set aside and has been turned into a sort of quite beautiful book in the traditions of, canonizing great texts, and that it is something that will look nice on people's kind of bourgeois bookshelves, if you like. It's been produced very professionally, I'll give you that, but I don't think that's a bad thing. For all that, there's a sort of an interesting moment in which all of these people have been trying to get hold of copies. What has struck me about the last couple of years in the republication of this book is just how calmly this whole issue has been treated and how smoothly the whole thing has passed off. It seems to me that it really shows that something has moved on in Germany's relationship to its Nazi past compared to, say, even 20 years ago, where this discussion would have been a lot more emotive and difficult, I think. There's a calmness in the debate about the Nazi past in Germany, which is something that wasn't there until comparatively recently. And I think by and large that's a good thing. The majority of people in Germany know that they have this history, as I say. They accept that fact and they think very carefully about how to handle it. And all of those mindsets and moods have been there in the republication of this book too. I take our colleague's point about the pedagogical utility of it totally. It seems to me that, and I hope that a lot of the people who've been buying this book have been teachers who can use it to take 2 pages of Mein Kampf, pull it apart, show how the rhetoric works, show how familiar some of the turns of phrase are, and raise the question in fairly direct fashion of what the dangers of some of the language are. Which gets me on to the question, who should be afraid of this? Well, many of the questions and many of our comments really have circled around the fact that this book hovers somewhere between a symbol and a text, right? And it's not what it says, it's what it stands for, or it's not just what it says, it's also what it stands for. In that sense, it's a very difficult question to answer, but for all its symbolic value and for all that it has a certain power in the hands of the misguided, a certain kind of oratic power as an object. I'm far more afraid of the language itself. I'm far more afraid of phrases like enemies of the people, or the will of the people, and the ease with which those terms can be thrown around in rhetoric which has an undercurrent of violence to it. And it seems to me that's the usefulness of this text as a teaching tool. It's very difficult to make the leap from a conversation like this to a conversation about some of the popular press, from whom I will only get back, well, this is common sense. But common sense, of course, is just ideology that we no longer recognise for what it is. And there's work to be done. But I hope that is a gesture towards them.
The critical edition of Mein Kampf completes a larger editorial project that the EFZ has been engaged in for the last 20 years or so, of critical editions of all of Hitler's writings. So this was the one missing thing. I can't remember. I think it's about 20 volumes that they've already published. None of them look like the Mein Kampf edition. None of them are as big and fat and voluminous. And so there's a shift of gear in the symbolic presentation of the thing, but the critical edition of all the other texts are already there. And the fact that this was the one text that was banned, interestingly, by the Bavarian state rather than the German state, it, I think, speaks to that oratic status, the close association with this notion of character. So it's not just that Hitler is the author, it's that Hitler is in many ways the key subject of the book that's created this nervousness around that. And I think that relates to what David was saying about the centrality of authenticity. What holds the whole text together is this intensely personal narrative. And that's what creates the awkwardness we have now in dealing with it. It's as if we're engaging with the character of Hitler rather than just with his political views. Of course, the notion of character in that book is in itself recycled. So the whole thing is set up, right, with the story of Hitler as a young chap and how he doesn't like school because he's not very bookish, but he loves running around fields and fighting with sticks. And then he's interested in the church as a young boy, not because he likes Christianity, but he likes the ritual and the passion and the emotion that people bring to it. So, all the themes of the later political philosophies are introduced through this personal experience during adolescence, and that's what draws you into this. It's a radical break with a tradition of writing political texts that take abstract principles or objectives and then deduce policy recommendations from them, right? This starts as a story about this young kid, and then there's the conflict with the father, where his character is really forged, hence, my struggle. That's a really key motif, except it's plagiarized from Wagner. Wagner portrays exactly the same thing in his autobiography. What turns him into the visionary artistic genius is the conflict with the father, who stands for convention and tradition and being bureaucratic, etc. And Hitler directly copies that. So, I think there is a resonance here with the contemporary resurgence of the politics of authenticity. You're voting not so much for Trump's particular policy recommendations, be they metaphorical or otherwise, but somehow for the reality factor of the character, right? And that is what makes this text so difficult, but also what makes it so relevant, I think, to the present. The historical context, the writing style, etc., in many ways are different. They're rooted in a completely different context. But pushing the authenticity of character as the thing that brings everything together and gives it its sort of ideological edge and sense of direction has, I think, immense contemporary resonance today.
David. It's interesting. I love the way that you put that just now. I'm actually tried to sell the editor on the idea of what the lessons of Donald Trump and Ed Balls on Strictly Come Dancing have. He said I needed to add at least one more carrot to this before he was convinced that I hadn't really thought at that stage of Hitler, because you're not really allowed to invoke Hitler in columns anymore, because otherwise everybody would want one. But it does make you think, doesn't it, that if you had literally did have a Hitler today, given that you don't have World War I for him to be a corporal in, and so on, then probably he would come through a reality show of some sort, some great supposedly shared experience, which somehow kind of unites a people in some series of attitudes, and so on. I also said fairly recently that maybe the first woman president of the United States will actually be Kim Kardashian. Some of you may be so academic that you don't know who that is, and you can just ask the person sitting next to you, who is this person, etc. It's not an Armenian philosopher, I can tell you that. And I also agree very much with what Neil was saying as well, which is that some of the things, and it comes back to your question about who should be afraid or why should we be afraid of the words in this book. And I think Neil was absolutely right to point out that the way in which some of the, if you like, the kind of concepts, which were not just in the book but also within the movement, are perpetually worrying at moments when they become very much used. I mean, if we were to say, if I was to be absolutely honest and say, what are the kind of tropes that really concern me at the moment? I have actually written down enemies of the people, because I'm not worried that some of these idiots on the alt-right give Hitler salutes or use the term Lügenpresse and so on. They're doing it for effect, like those bloody Tory MPs who dress up as Hitler at the, etc., and probably know the words to Tomorrow Belongs to Me from Cabaret, and so on, but because they're somehow kind of, they think it's funny and it's impressive. That's not what worries me at all. The formation of, if you like, groups that would revolutionise societies towards hatred and conflict won't come through people wearing silly uniforms and so on. It won't. But it will come through the deployment of languages that essentially suggest, firstly, the absolute incompatibility of peoples, culturally and in other kind of ways. The way we cannot be doing with these people in one way or another, and the notion of the necessity for exclusion. That will be certainly one aspect of it. The second concept, absolutely, which is crucial, is the concept of having been betrayed. It's very much linked up to a kind of populist notion of what they, liberals, the bubble, whatever it is you call them, do to us, London, whatever it can be. But it's taken that one step further. And that's why people reacted in the way they did, with such worry, to the Daily Mail's enemies of the people problem and so on. And that's why the Lord Lynn Truss's, not Lynn Truss, Elizabeth Truss's response to it was so inadequate, because it really was a moment when you needed to say that this language, not as impermissible, we don't have impermissible language, but what the implications of the language actually was. And that comes to your point about who should be worried. And I think Neil's absolutely right. You worry about the concepts, the recurrence of the concepts which made the ideology. See if there's anything else that there was I also want to pick up the point about Russia and so on, because that also strikes me. There wasn't a lie that Hitler and the Nazis weren't prepared to tell. And in fact, it's actually out there in Mein Kampf. He says the most important thing, he says at one point, is always, it doesn't matter if they laugh at you, it doesn't matter if they show that you've been lying, the most important thing is they talk about you, is that you're always at the centre and the focus of people's reaction and so on. Well, we've seen a fair bit of that. But we've also seen the growth of what we call post-fact. Now, you can argue about whether or not actually this is a development rather than a sudden revolution and so on, and we can talk about this for a long time. But if you look at, let's say, the tweets coming out of the Russian embassy, they take you right back to a period before the fall of the wall, and actually right back to the Stalin era and the Hitler era, from the point of view of what it is that an official representative of government is prepared to say in public which has absolutely no truth in it whatsoever, but which serves their propaganda purpose, and the resources they're prepared to deploy behind creating a story through false news and so on in order to support that contention. It's really novel for us, and we are really struggling with ways of dealing with it, and it relates to other kinds of problems that we have. And that reminds us of something else, which is that although the new formations of things that we thought we'd defeated long ago will have some features in common with those things, some kind of psychological features in common, and some practical, they will be quite often in a completely new way. And of course, there's always the danger that people like me who are on the lookout and will overinterpret them and see them where they don't really exist. But the one you talked about is one that's worrying me at the moment.
Can I very quickly just respond to one point there? The alt-right, and I agree we shouldn't be hysterical about a few fringe groups, but what does worry me about them is not that they're neo-Nazis out there, it's that they think they've won. And I think this is a shift, right? We've had neo-Nazis posing as, oppositional. There's the system, here are we're telling the truth, we're a repressed minority. These people are standing up there and saying, we've won. They feel, I know Trump has distanced himself a little bit, but they feel empowered by the Trump victory to now pose on the side of the winners. And I think that is a shift. I don't think we have seen that since 1945, that people using the Hitler salute say, not we're a repressed minority, but we've won, we are now the majority. I think that's a new thing.
We'll have time for a couple more questions, but before doing that, I'm going to take advantage of my position up here and just ask a question myself, which you can answer in due course rather than straight away. But it seems to me that David's comments about the post-fact society, which we hear a lot about, pose a problem for those of us who are professional historians in response to that. And that problem, in a sense, was posed by Maiken's sort of sceptical observations about the nature of this scholarly edition and the profusion of footnotes, which somehow is out of kilter with what professional historians have been saying for the last 20 years about there being a plurality of narratives out there, and what we've been getting from the culture more broadly, where fact and fiction is often mixed up in the earthy novels that we read. Yet the publication or the republication of texts such as Mein Kampf, or the trends of politics that we see both in this country and in Europe and in the United States, bring a sort of a contrary impulse in us, which is to reassert the supremacy of fact. But we are at a disadvantage in doing so, perhaps, because the other trend of the last 20 or 30 years has been to undermine our expertise as academics. We are in a much more democratic culture for good and for ill. And I think that is perhaps part of the problem that we face in responding both to contemporary politics and the republication of Mein Kampf in the context of contemporary politics. There's a question just there, Jack.
Yes, my name is Peter Sky. Just a comment and then a question. My comment is, it's only a few days since a Russian television station that ran a programme with two dancers dancing in mock extermination camp uniforms with yellow stars on. Not only that, the woman, I believe, was the wife of a senior official close to Putin's government. So be careful of talking about reality shows, careful what you wish for. But that leads on to my question, which is about signals. Surely, the issue about publication of Mein Kampf finds that discussion in learned academic circles. But is there a possibility it then leads on to people saying, well, it's right to to be published out, if then lead on to a discussion about whether there's a need anymore to have Holocaust denial as a law, and does that then start to send a signal about what is then legitimate in public discourse?
Thank you.
I'm not an academic, I haven't read Mein Kampf, but I'm curious if there's anything you might be able to say with respect to the protocols of the Elders of Zion. A lot of the anti-Semitism that I hear nowadays seems to be related to that, and I'm wondering to what extent did Mein Kampf draw on that? How is that dealt with in Germany? I'm just curious to know, because a lot of the ideas associated with that seem to me are being recycled, and that of course has been widely republished this century around the world as a factual document, not as a forgery and a plagiarism.
Thank you very much. And there's a last question from a gentleman at the front who's been waiting exceedingly patiently.
A few years ago there was a very good BBC television series called The Nazis: A Warning from History. Are we, when I say we, the general public, not inoculated against any mass taking up of right-wing sort of ideas that were in Mein Kampf by the simple knowledge of, as David said, the wall did get built?
Thank you. Daniel, would you like to start?
Okay, maybe taking up your question and also the comments by David about post-fact society and the question of authenticity. One of the big questions in Germany after 1945, let's say after 1948 in West Germany, was what is an authentic German if he's not a Nazi? And the big answer, the main answer is he or she has to be democratic, that's it. And here we can see a link to the way how the Institute für Zeitgeschichte, the Institute for Contemporary History produced this annotated version of Mein Kampf. It fits in a very particular way of Germans trying to come to terms with the past, and this way has to do with educating people, learning them to be democrats by showing them what went wrong. And this was kind of the basic way how they set up these big memorial centers in the concentration camps, establishing kind of a shock therapy. We show them what is terribly wrong, and then they will believe in a democratic system. I'm not quite sure if this is really working, right? And currently there's a big debate going on in this concentration camp memorial center. They also think it's not really working. And therefore I doubt that what they have done with Mein Kampf is really working too. I think if you want to teach Germans to become democrats, you have to work with the positive ingredients of a democratic system, but not with shock therapy. And the other thing is, which I think is highly problematical, is I don't believe that you can learn from history, because history doesn't repeat itself. And this raises a very difficult question for us as historians: what are we really doing? Right? Somehow we have to be schizophrenic. In one way we believe in our research, but on the other hand I'm not quite sure if we can educate. And so I think that's the reason why I'm not quite sure what they're really trying to achieve. And this is also the reason why I do not understand why Mein Kampf is such a big success financially. Personally, I believe Mein Kampf should be accessible for everybody without any problems. I used to be very different when I'm a continental European, so before I came to England, I thought we have to protect the folk and we have to make it difficult to read Mein Kampf. Since I'm here, I changed my opinion completely. I think these books, such sources, should be accessible freely, but I'm not quite sure if there should be a link towards education in terms of to learn the Brits or the Germans or the French to become Democrats. But that's a bigger problem of Holocaust education in general. I'm not quite sure if this really makes sense. Thank you, Daniel. Mike?
Very briefly, one factual question we hadn't answered: the royalties. It's a very cheap edition. So the idea it's big and looks incredibly bourgeois, but it's incredibly cheap. I can't remember. I think it's about 40 euros for the 2 volumes. But all the proceeds go to a Jewish charity, so it's not a profit-making thing. I think there are 2 phases in which Germans have dealt with the past, and I think there's been a marked shift, and I think this edition is part of a much broader paradigm shift. So yes, we've had the shock effects, let's send all the school children to concentration camps. I remember I went to one in 1986, and was simply the done thing. What is happening at the moment, and Bavaria has taken an interesting role in this, is I think is something completely different. It's more to do with studying, if you like, the mindset and the histories of perpetrators, as well as whatever we call it, the bystander society or the implicated wider public. So, the EFZ was involved in the opening of a huge, big new documentation center museum right in the heart of Munich, in what was the kind of governmental, or the party headquarters and the surrounding district in the city, where there was nothing until 2 years ago, other than a few plaques that dealt with this history. Now I have some issues with the way that museum has been done, but it's very specifically about the role of the city of Munich in the movement rather than just the generic history. The EFZ is also involved in the complete redesign of the documentation center and museum at the Obersalzberg, Hitler's Alpine mountain retreat, from where he actually directed an awful lot of business during the Third Reich. It's currently a sort of small center there, but it's being redeveloped with a huge, big budget, a lot of it funded directly by the Bavarian state. So it seems to me there's a second wave here of dealing with the past, which is a little bit different from the idea that we are automatically inoculated by seeing the horrors. Part of this, though, is that we're no longer doing it just as academics or as politicians. There's a huge popular culture out there about the Holocaust and about the Third Reich on a scale that we've never seen before, and has happened in the last 10 years. I work a little bit with the National Holocaust Centre up in Nottinghamshire, one of the key institutions for educating school children, come from all over the UK every day on buses. We ask them what they know about the Third Reich. It's the boy in the striped pyjamas. They've all seen it. It's their one source of information. Right? And this is even more trivial and Hollywoody than the Schindler's List version of it was. That probably would have been the answer 10 years ago. There's a huge popular literature out there now, all kinds of sometimes quite trashy novels about the Holocaust, and some slightly more serious ones like Jonathan Littell's The Kindly Ones, a kind of fictitious account, but based on a lot of real research. But again, the Holocaust told from the perspective of the perpetrator, or a fictitious perpetrator, who's a synthesis of real historical perpetrators. And a lot of people have said this is Holocaust pornography, but no matter how we judge it, it's out there. And so we can't step back as historians and say, okay, that's it, we can't learn anything from history, because there's a lot of other stuff happening in this space. And I think in one way or another, as experts, much derided as experts now are in the new age of authenticity, we do have a job to do there, and intervening in these debates. We're no longer generating them, we're merely contributing to them. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, let me just try and pick up on a different question that was asked, just in the spirit of trying to touch on as many things as possible. The Russian dancers in the concentration camp outfit. As you were speaking, it brought to mind a trip to Wrocław this time last year, where I spent a week in the archives. And it's a charming city. I've not been there before. Classic chocolate box, Central European Market Square, and so on. I was quite charmed by the place. But while I was there, the market square was sort of occupied symbolically for an hour by sort of far-right militia men dressed in black uniforms who burned the effigy of an Orthodox Jew. And it had all those classic ingredients of such a theatrical stunt, you know, passers-by saying nothing, the police just looking on, you know, and you think, good God. Now that wouldn't happen in Germany, okay? And I think there's the difference. So to connect that to the gentleman's question about are we inoculated, no, nobody is, but I think there's something in the condition of being German since 1945 underlined by or drummed into people by the political culture, the pedagogic culture, that means there is a very profound sort of cultural, social resistance to this stuff in a way that makes me feel that this book is less dangerous in Germany than in most other places on the planet. As far as your questions about post-facticity go, I mean, it's an incredibly difficult thing to discuss because we're grappling with the novelty of what feels like a very big cultural shift. There are different things in there, obviously, and one is, I think you've alluded to a certain kind of mood of postmodern skepticism over the last 30 years about the authority of history, about history as narrative and therefore as fiction, which creates space for other people to come in with their spurious versions of events. Another dynamic there clearly is the digital revolution, which has lowered the barriers to entry, if you like, for publishing. Whether it's really caused anything new to happen, I don't know. It may just be that things are now said on Twitter that used to be said in the pub. But both of those things seem, you're quite right, the decline of certain forms of deference to authority, which has its good and its bad sides. Just by way of, I suppose, ending on something positive and by showing that people will listen to teachers and that we shouldn't give up. When this is, and also outing myself, David isn't the only Euro-communist on the stage here.
You didn't have to tell me that. Your stuff about common sense and ideology, I nearly said, that's straight out of Gramsci.
Well, I was just going to quote Gramsci. You know, when I was 16, the guy who got me fascinated in history, the school teacher, wrote up on the board Gramsci's great line, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. And I'm afraid that's where I have to kind of plant my flag at the moment until I find a better place to plant it.
Thank you, Neil. David.
Okay, I'll try as hard as possible not to duplicate what's already been said. There were one or two kind of discrete questions in there. The question of authority and expertise is a hugely difficult question. All I can say is that when I talk to sixth formers in schools, the question of where you get information from and what information you trust is by far and away the biggest discussion we have. On Holocaust denial, legislation, public discourse and so on, I completely understand why it was that post-war Germany outlawed Holocaust denial. I think it's time that they reconsidered that. The suppression of discussion is now one of the most potent propaganda weapons that people have on places like the far right. In other words, what are you so afraid of, and so on. I am in no way scared of taking on any Holocaust denier in open debate and trouncing them with the facts. And if I can't transform the facts, that you may say, well, you know, then in that case you're not going to win that battle anyway, and so on. So it seems to me pretty clear that eventually we'll move away from, and incidentally, allowing people to say something is not a legitimization of their view in the sense of giving it any kind of rectitude. People know, excuse my language here, people know that other people talk bollocks a lot. Okay, you only have to be at a football match to hear people's opinions about players, etc., and how other people react to those opinions to know that we all know that. In other words, I don't think the mere fact of saying the thing by somebody somehow or other gives it currency amongst other people, whereas suppressing it, funnily enough, might actually have that effect. On the protocols, of the Elders of Zion, I've written quite extensively about this. It was quite interesting, actually. In Mein Kampf, Hitler is sly about the protocols, and there was a big question about whether Hitler actually believed that the protocols were genuine or not. And the suggestion is, on the whole, that he didn't really, not the protocols themselves. But his formulation that he used about it, as other people did, was whether or not they were a forgery, and the Jews are very determined to tell you they weren't, he said, they describe perfectly what has happened up until now. In other words, it didn't matter whether they were a forgery or not. And going back to our kind of post-fact question, it is anyway, whether they're true or not, it is the kind of thing that those Jews would do. And it is widely circulated in Arab countries at the moment. In fact, that is the main constituency for something like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Societies which, in any case, and quite a lot of these societies, Pakistan is also very susceptible to this, have a tendency to default onto conspiracy theories, and the more lurid the conspiracy theories are, the more they tend to default upon them. One of the really extraordinary things about this kind of the recent Trump thing was the way in which he encouraged or had around him some of the most bizarre conspiracy theorists operating on the American internet. A person I've encountered myself on the Andrew Neil programme, look it up, it's well worth a look, called Alex Jones, was actually somebody whose programme Trump went on. And the encouragement of, since we were talking about post-fact, things like exotic conspiracy theories is part of that. Now, nowadays, so much work has been done on the protocols that it's very easy, wherever you encounter it in these countries, to come up and say, did you know that, etc., and you can kind of beat it down. What's not possible to do it is in these other countries. Finally, just on the question of memory and so on, I'm going to say this about Germany in the present. I have become, over the course of the last 20, 25 years, from somebody who didn't really want to go there, an enormous admirer, not a sort of stupid admirer, but enormous admirer of Germany and what the German people, by and large, have achieved, and the way in which they've thought about themselves and so on. It strikes me that for whatever reason, and we can get the reasons, they have come to terms with their history because they've had to, in a way that, say, Brits just refuse to do. We just absolutely won't do it. We have a kind of self-heroising notion of ourselves that will not be, that will not go away, and that was actually significantly present in some of the psychology of the Brexit vote. I saw it myself and I talked to people like it. We could go back to the thing that we once were, to the Britain that we once were, and so on. This kind of notion of ourselves, which is really, really interesting. Well, you don't get many Germans saying, well, I'd like to go back to the way things were in 1939, and so on. So maybe, and that's it, it's kind of knocked out of them. Now, I interviewed the German artist Anselm Kiefer last week, and he said to me two things, but one of the things he said to me was that the refugees, can you imagine? I mean, look at the fuss we made about taking 20,000 refugees, and the Germans have taken over 800,000, coming up for 900,000. It's not been easy, and so on, but they are unlikely to reward Angela Merkel by throwing her out of office at the next elections. I know these are kind of hostages to fortune, and so on. And so actually I would echo, since we're here, the fact that the last people in Europe I am worried about, are the Germans. However, your story about Wrocław was truly terrifying, actually. Really, really, really bad. The idea that the Polish government, the Polish authorities, or that Polish civil society would allow such thing to happen uncontested, given modern history and their sensibilities, is truly worrying. And guess what? In the pantheon of new illiberal democracies now, Poland is represented by its government, made up of the Law and Justice Party, which is just such an illiberal party, which, when it finds itself in real difficulty, as it will, you could quite easily see it shading over into something more problematic.
Well, thank you, David, and not least for that final comment, sort of, which points to the sort of a troubling separation of a democracy from liberalism through which we are now living. It's my last pleasurable task to say some thank yous this evening. My first goes to Daniel Wildmann, whose idea this panel was, and without whose inspiration this event would not have taken place. This evening's event is the first collaboration between the Pears Institute and the Leo Baeck Institute, and seeing so many of you here this evening, I'm sure it won't be the last. I'd like to thank all three of our panelists who not only have held my attention and your attention, I'm sure, but have also said so much, truly, which will reverberate in my mind and keep me thinking for a long time after this event. I'd like to thank all of you who have contributed, and all of you who have turned up this evening and really have helped make this a memorable and stimulating evening. And I hope you will now join me in expressing your thanks to all of our speakers this evening. Thank you very much.